Grüß, willkommen in einem aufregendes Video. Welcome to another exciting video, in this case episode 67 of my game system design series. In this video I'll be investigating the issues of a battalion element scale set of rules for World War II and Cold War. First I need to clarify. What I mean is how can you create a reasonable set of rules where each element or base represents a battalion? As a battalion represents a reasonably complex formation, it's not as simple as a platoon or even company element scale set of rules. This lists some of the rules which are available at this scale. When I first studied this topic back in 2013, there were not many rules at this scale. However, I've really noticed there has been an explosion in a number of these rules since 2013. The most common set of rules are KISS, Megablitz, DBA, World War II and D-Day to Berlin. There are a number of other free rules or rules which I think are not particularly complete. Another option which I have is to convert a board game into a figure gaming format. So for World War II and Cold War, the SPI Modern Battles game system was my particular main target in this particular case. Breakthrough was supposed to come out in 2021, but I'm still waiting for it, so I suspect it will never come out. However, the rules that I'll be using is not really the topic of this video, as I'm more focused on the general issues of battalion element scale rules. So while I'll be using an actual set of rules as my example, this applies to any set of rules you may play at this particular scale. For this video I'm excluding what I call big base rules. There are a number of rules which use a big base into which are placed company-sized elements. The most common is Panzer Corps and LWRS. But the battalion scale version of BBWW2B is another example. In these big base set of rules, while the maneuver unit is a battalion, it does comprise of a number of elements, thus does not suffer from many of the issues of rules which use a single element as a battalion. When I use the term battalion, I am referring to a specific size formation. Some armies will call battalion size formations regiments, and others the size of the regiment more closely resembles a battalion. There is some flexibility in what this formation size actually is. While this is a very rough guide, a tank battalion normally consists of between 30 and 60 tanks. An infantry battalion consists of between 400 and 800 men. An artillery battalion consists of between 8 and 18 weapons, and supporting anti-tank or assault gun battalion consists of between 24 guns or vehicles to 48 guns or vehicles. There are lots of exceptions to these rules, with many Western tank battalions consisting of more than 60 tanks. But in this case, as long as the number of tanks is not 90 or more, then it can be considered a tank battalion. Let's now look at the way some of the different rules treat battalions in terms of combat capability. The simplest system is all battalions are the same in terms of combat capability. While simple, and this can give you a very easy method of creating force mixes, it's not really very accurate, and apart from very abstract and simple rules, is not commonly used in figure gaming. It's more common in the world of board gaming, not figure gaming. I need to point out I'm not considering morale or quality of the battalion. This is a layer which goes over the actual combat strength of the battalion and is not the major focus of this video. I will briefly deal with this topic later, but some of the rules do embed quality and morale into the combat capability of a battalion, and I'll try and outline this when it occurs. First, let's look at the system which Megablitz uses to determine the combat strengths of each battalion, as this is possibly the most common system used at this scale. Megablitz builds morale into the combat strength, which is viable, but to make this video as simple as possible, I'll exclude troop quality and morale for now. For each 15 tanks or one Western-style infantry company or 12 guns, you get 1 strength point. A post-41 Soviet rifle regiment was basically 4 strength points in this case. As you can see, the base strength of a battalion is about 3 strength points if there are 3 companies or at least 45 tanks. Support weapons are excluded from this, and the US, which has 1 light tank company in the battalion, would have a strength of 4 strength points, if not more. The Soviet tank battalion, which only has 30 tanks, would be 2 strength points. There is a modifier for equipment which covers tanks which are unusually good compared with the average. The examples provided are reasonable, but would also cover the French Heavy Char, the British Matilda in 1940-41. I guess the T-34 in 1941 may also fall in this category. By 1942, I would suspect it's lost its edge. The King Tiger and IS-3 may also fall into this category as well. Obviously, when a clearly superior force attacks an inferior force, as occurred in Manchuria in 1945, the attackers would probably gain this benefit as well. The benefit also includes special weapons, such as German engineers in 1940. I suspect these modifiers would be reasonably rare. There is a modifier for being a tank or infantry unit. This is specific to the game system, but you need to ensure the different combat arms do have combat strengths which reflect their advantages and weaknesses. In simple terms, tanks are good for attacking and infantry good for defending in suitable terrain. The Megablitz system is rather good, and many other rules adopt something similar or at least along the same line. It offers significantly more accuracy compared with the every battalion is the same system used in many board games, yet retains a lot of the simplicity advantages of that system. Not all board games uses the simple all battalions are the same idea. Another system you could consider is this more detailed board game methodology. This comes from the SPI board game called Würzburg, and this game system is used in a wide range of games ranging from World War II to Cold War. In this case, SPI has provided a specific combat value for each battalion, or in the Soviet cases, battalions and regiments. This would also embed quality and morale, with the US forces getting a better ratio when you look at the SPs per tank or company size formations. I'm not very happy with these values, but the basic principle of providing a separate attack and defense value has a lot of merit. The first value is attack, the second defense, and the third is movement. The artilleries have a separate indirect fire values, with the first being for attack, the second for FPF, and the last being range. Their normal non-artillery combat value only allows them to defend, as they would use their bombardment or their attack indirect fire strength for attack purposes. In summary, providing a basic ratio of actual strength to game combat values is the optimal method, which of course depends on the rules. Now we come to a possible issue. In Megablitz, the player needs to keep track of the strength of the element, with this strength reducing due to the results of combat. In principle, this is a good idea, has many benefits. However, it is a major game system friction factor, as counters are required to keep track of strength. I'd personally use big bases in this case, perhaps movement trace, which allows you to place elements in them and use that system to keep track of casualties. Otherwise, you end up with lots of counters on the playing area. In the SPI board game, which I've already mentioned, this is not required. The combat results affects the entire battalion, so a loss would require the element to be entirely removed. There is no SP loss tracking required, and from personal experience, this is a superior system in terms of playability. This playability is achieved in the CRT, and while players will need to consult a CRT when conducting combat, this ends up being far less of an issue than keeping track of losses on the playing area for every single element. Now we come to the second issue. If a player is going to deploy 48 elements, each of which could now have a different combat strength, you end up with a lot of cross-referencing. The optimal system is to narrow the number of possible combat values down as much as possible and use the figure on the base to provide you with the idea of the strength of the unit or the element. For example, an infantry base with 3 figures is inferior, 4 figures is standard, and 5 figures is superior, and there would be a associated combat value for each of these 3 categories. If we go back to the SPI board game example, we can see here that the 2 main divisional size formations in the US Army in the late 1970s are as follows. Each division has 5 different element types, all of which are fundamentally the same. The US players could use M60s to represent the tank battalions, M113s to represent the mech battalions, M109s and M1110s to represent the artillery battalions, and in this case a Sheridan to represent the mech recce battalion. If the US player fielded 3 divisions, there are still only 5 different element types. When we add core resources, we would need to add the long-range artillery battalion and a helicopter figure for the attack helicopter squadron. Aircraft figures would represent air support, but I will not make that unduly too complex, and I'm not particularly including it here. Generally, one plane either represents 1 strength point, or 2 or 4, depending on some kind of ratio based on the aircraft figure that you use. Originally, when I saw this, that is in the SPI board game, I did not like it as it would require me to cross-reference the combat strength on a table somewhere. But then I was reminded that almost every World War II or Cold War figure game set of rules requires you to do this anyway. For Corps Commander, the sheet covers about 20 different element types per side. Cross-referencing 5 to 7 NATO and 7 to 9 Soviet figure types is significantly simpler. Incidentally, this would also apply to Mega Blitz. However, with Mega Blitz, once an element suffers losses, you need to record it. I normally use a dice to indicate the hits, but I must admit it's not really a very good solution for 6mm. I think it works better for 15mm as the dice are not so noticeable as a result. If using a card-based ad hoc scenario generation system, the unique values of each battalion size element can be included on the card. This shows an example of 4 different German divisions, with the information required to move and conduct combat for each individual element. If using such a system, you could use the cards as the element stat cheat sheets. Let's now look at a US Armoured Division, dated January 1945. Apart from the Engineer Battalion, each battalion is big when compared with its German equivalent. Each US battalion would be considered superior with the associated combat effects. We could argue each tank battalion has a reasonable share of light tank, which makes them not as effective as a medium tank. But as the bulk of tanks are medium, we can assume the quality of each battalion would be classed as, let's say, average in this particular case. I must admit the mixing of light tanks with medium tanks in the battalion could be considered as an issue by some players. Light tanks are clearly inferior to medium tanks, and heavy tanks being the most powerful of all. If all the light tanks were in a light tank battalion, then it could have an inferior strength. Then the medium tanks could remain in the medium tank battalion and have the appropriate strength for a medium tank battalion. One argument is the number of tanks in the US battalion was so high that there was always sufficient wastage, and even this would generally even out the effect anyway. This argument is sound, but it does still annoy me so much that so much averaging and rounding is being conducted here. I suppose one possible option is to count all the tanks in a division and divide accordingly. I will for now ignore the attached formations. If we assume a large battalion consists of 60 tanks, we could say the US Armoured Division has 4 medium tank battalions, one of which is REC, and 1 light tank battalion size formation. What we have here is an accurate division, but the structure is not accurate. The advantage is the division strength is accurate, but the component battalions are nominal, and we're dealing with an average battalion element scale. But the accurate formation is a division. That is, at a divisional level we achieve accuracy. Another issue we may face is the regimental support formations. What do we do with these assets? The obvious conclusion is to distribute to the component battalion, which makes the battalion strength issue even more complex to deal with. What we can see is the solution to this issue is not as easy as you may otherwise think, assuming you wish reasonable levels of accuracy. Let's look at some possible scenarios with their advantages and disadvantages. The simplest system is to assume all battalions are the same, with possible differences for light, medium and heavy tank battalions, mech infantry, motorised infantry, foot infantry and so on. It could be possible to restrict your entire game to 16 to 24 different element types. This system is more commonly used in board games, where, for example, all divisions may have a strength of 4, for example. The advantage of this system is that it would be simple. The disadvantage is you end up with a comparatively bland game. This type of system may work if you want to create a very simple set of rules for very quick games or for very large games. We could add some complexity, as with the board game example. Different nationalities could have different strengths. Thus, minor allies or Axis nations have a strength of, let's say, 4, German 6, Western Allies 8, early Soviet 1, late Soviet 4, and so on. In terms of different periods, assuming you always play with historical forces, these values could even vary by year. So the German Infantry Division would be 6 in 1939 to 43, but in 1944 drops to 5 or 4. If we're fighting the Battle of the Bulge, all the German infantry would still be a single strength, just a different strength than the 1939 version. This minor added complexity may make the system more palatable. The next system, which most rules seem to employ, such as megablitz, is to assume the strength of an element is based on the number of tanks, guns and men in that battalion. The system you could employ are endless, or the different systems you could employ are endless, and I'll not cover the options or all the options in any detail, but whatever system you use, you end up with battalions all having different strengths. The way megablitz deals with this is each strength point actually represents a step, or that is, each element actually represents a step, which could be lost in combat. This requires record keeping. If you use a system where the element lacks steps, then its strength would differ and you would need to keep a track of this. Or in simple terms, in megablitz, you need to actually have counters which indicate the strength of all your elements anyway. So whether they lose strength or not, it doesn't matter. You basically don't need to track any of this sort of stuff. The advantage is you still have a reasonably simple system, but you have significantly more flavour to the different force mixes. The disadvantage is now you need to keep track of the different strengths of each element, normally with a counter on the playing area, which detracts from the bling. Let's analyse this downside to determine if it's something which could severely affect the rules. A US Armoured Division, a mechanised division, would consist of 5 different element types. If we include supporting elements, we could end up with 8 or 10 different element types, of which many will be in the low number, perhaps 1 to 3 each. Is this an issue? Considering when you play a typical game of Spearhead, FFT3 or Corps Commander, you need to deal with significantly more variety, I suspect really not. In summary, the additional complexity of having battalions of different strength does not really appear to be an issue compared with most other figure gaming rules, so let's just get over it. What about tank battalions of different strengths? Assuming you're using official organisation, then all tank battalions would typically be the same. If we're dealing with a US 1989 force mix, where some divisions use M1s and others M60s, this means you do need 2 different tank strengths. Once again, if the M1 battalion is represented by M1 figure and the M60 battalion is represented by M60 figure, then there's no real issue. As long as you have unique figures for each strength, you are actually in the same boat as if you were playing a game of, let's say, Spearhead. While this system seems reasonable, players may still be unhappy with the lack of building battalion strength details. Tank battalions could have a lot more than just tanks in them. They could have supporting equipment, infantry, etc., and they all have an impact. The issue is even more severe with infantry battalions. A Russian battalion 1941 possesses little support equipment, so assuming 500 men in that case, are they the same as 500 German infantry? Probably not. You can mitigate this with the concept of troop quality or morale, but that tends to be rather subjective. One solution is to use the point system from another set of rules to determine the combat effectiveness of each battalion. Let's look at an example. I'm using the Corps Commander set of rules, and as an example, the 2nd Panzer Division in June 1944 is shown here. This shows all the battalion-sized formations in that division, with supporting the troops at headquarters level. The reason why I picked Corps Commander is, even though each element represents up to 9 tanks, each strength point represents 1 vehicle or gun or 10 men. This brings it down to a very fine scale. I could use Spearhead or FFT3 point system, however each element represents a platoon, so I do lose a bit of fidelity for those particular point systems. The second advantage of using Corps Commander is the point system is directly related to the weapon, so armour value is based on the average frontal armour of the vehicle, with each point equal to 10 mil of armour. The gun value is based on its maximum penetration ability, again 1 point per 10 mil of penetration. Points are applied to speed, special weapons and a host of other factors. This is overkill, but as it's easy for me to use this approach, I will show this possible overkill approach. The final reason is some point systems are not that accurate. FFT3 is very good but very complex, but Spearhead is not as good as, even if it's simpler. Corps Commander is in between, and I have some good force mix tools which use that point system, although I could use FFT3, and I may study that to determine if that's a better system, as FFT3 has exactly the fidelity that I require, but I have Corps Commander, I know the algorithms that it uses, and I can extrapolate to other weapon systems that are not contained in the standard lists of weapons. The system I'm getting these values for adjusts the points for morale, but in this case the first value represents trained or standard troops, so in all cases I'm going to be comparing battalions if their morale value is trained. Let's assume we want a conversion system which gives us a Panzer battalion value of 4-2, 4 attack, 2 defence, which totals 6 points. Divide 1,895 by 6 gives us a conversion rate of 315 per point and a possible value of 4.2 for the Panther battalion. In the most part, I will just use a single value, as this way this converts into a combat strength. As this converts into a combat strength, or how you want to convert into a combat strength does depend on the rules you wish. Thus, the Panzer 5 or Panther battalion converts to 4.4 or rounded to 4. The support troop rounds down to 0. If we look at the armoured regiment, we end up with 5 strength points. The motorised battalions are the same at 5 strength points. The headquarters support battalion gives us 3 strength points, which we would allocate to the Panzer Grenadier battalions, perhaps 1 per battalion, giving them 6 strength points each. Let's now look at the German 35th Infantry Division on the 6th of June. In this case, train values are the second points value. What we see here is the infantry battalions are 2 strength points, and with a single regimental support strength point, which could be allocated to, let's say, 1 battalion. Let's now look at the US Army, in this case the 1st Infantry Division on the 6th of June. In this case, the US infantry battalions are much stronger than the German battalions, with more support strength as well. Here we have the US Armoured and Armoured Infantry Battalion of the US 5th Armoured Division, which gives us 6 strength points for the tank and armoured infantry battalions each. I did find it surprising each type of battalion had the same strength or points value. The way you interpret the points value depends on the type of battalion. Thus, there is a difference if the battalion is a tank battalion because it has certain benefits and disadvantages, mainly attack versus over defence, and infantry has different benefits accordingly. But again, the way you convert these points into actual combat values do represent or do depend on the rules that you're using. Let's now move over to the Eastern Front. This shows the infantry regiment of the 42nd Guard Infantry Division. The Soviet infantry battalions have a strength of 1, so I suppose you'd be better off fielding a regiment which would give you a strength of 5 strength points. This does kind of align with my expectations. This shows the tank brigade of the 18th Tank Corps, and we can quickly see we need to scale this up to a brigade rather than using battalions. If we field a brigade, we'd have a strength of 7, which is reasonable. The number of tanks is about the same as a German or US battalion in 1944, June 1944. I must say I was a bit surprised at some aspects of this analysis, as it did not align with my initial gut feeling, especially the strength of the German and US motorised infantry battalions. I must admit this approach is viable. I'm uncertain about the regimental support. Perhaps this could be deployed as a support element, although allocating this to the supporting battalions may be a better approach, although this could result in one battalion having a different strength to the other, which is not a good idea. Perhaps taking the regimental value and dividing this by the number of battalions, rounding accordingly, would be a better strategy. This is basically minor details which could be easily dealt with. Let's now look at an entire division, in this case the British Guards Armoured Division in June 1944. The results are rather interesting. The indirect fire weapons need to be treated in a special manner, with the self-propelled howitzer battalion having more strength points. A lot of this is due to the fact that they are self-propelled and armoured. The indirect fire would be similar to the towed battalion, assuming the same number of tubes. The anti-tank battalion would also need to be treated in a special manner. Perhaps its effect would be only against armour. The same may be the case with the tank destroyer battalion. But in summary, the standard battalion seems to have a value of 5 strength points, with the purely motorised infantry only having 3 strength points. When I initially created this video, I had no real clear endpoint. I was going to rationalise the issue out to arrive at some sort of logical answer during the creation of the video. Using points from other rules was an idea I'd never really thought of when I started this video. It was an idea which popped into my head in the middle of creating this particular video. As a result, I wanted to check a few other comparisons first. I then wondered what the results would be for older divisions, perhaps a German 1939 Panzer Battalion, specifically from the 1st Panzer Division. The results were what I expected. The Panzer battalions were very small at 2 strength points. If we move to the motorised infantry battalion within the 2nd Panzer Division, we end up with a battalion with a strength of 3. These are half the value of the 1944 motorised battalion. I suspect the ratios used may need to be modified by the period covered. The other solution is to reduce the ratio from 1 in 312 or 15 to 1 in 200, which does increase the strength of the infantry to 5, but makes the 1944 motorised battalion very powerful at about 9. Doing this analysis had made me wonder about heavy tanks. Will I get my mega powerful heavy tank battalion? The answer was in most cases no, mainly because heavy tanks were not organised in large battalions in the most part. The Russian organised their heavy tanks into regiments of 20 vehicles, which results in a strength of 2. Nothing particularly exciting here. The German Tiger I battalions, which only consisted of 21 Tiger I tanks, gives us about the same strength, which is again not very exciting. The German King Tiger battalion of 42 gives us a much higher value of 7 strength points. Now we're seeing something which makes me take attention. However, clearly your heavy tank battalions are not really going to be super units. In most cases they were used to break through a front line, so you may be better off giving them some special benefit against anti-tank defences. My general preference is to always use a formula-based approach, which, as I've discovered, results in some interesting and unexpected conclusions. I do need to clarify that the Corps Commander point system does not take into account the specific abilities of each formation type. A tank battalion is going to have a very good attack ability, while infantry would have a superior defence ability if in suitable terrain. Thus, 1 strength point could represent a specific attack and defence ratio, perhaps for armour 1 attack and half defence, and for infantry the reverse. Also, the point system does also reflect the movement ability, so for foot elements the points value is less because the movement ability of the element is less. The points value is not a raw combat ability. It does include everything and would also influence movement rates, which is something we've not really covered particularly much yet. Now let's look at supporting formations or battalions, which do need some special consideration. In this example, a 10.5 centimetre artillery battalion has a points value of 252 points, which gives it a strength of 1. This needs to have a specific meaning based on the weapon types, perhaps 2 bombardment points as well as 1 defence point. There is also not much difference between the 10.5 centimetre and 15 centimetre if we do a simple divide by 315, so perhaps a more complex table may need to be used. In this case, the main difference would be the range. The Tank Destroyer battalion gives us 3 strength points, but this weapon class may need some special rules which reflect the way it was used. I suspect its main effect would be when attacked by armour. The same would apply with anti-tank battalions. In simple terms, you need to perform different conversion ratios for different troop types depending on what those troop types were normally used. The rules used also influences this a great deal. So we've arrived at 3 basic systems, all of which have advantages and disadvantages. Let's look at how they compare. In the first approach, which is all battalions are the same, we can quickly and easily create army lists and players only need to remember a few different element values. However, the game may become bland and lacks historical accuracy. This is commonly used in older board games. In the second system, battalion strength is based on numbers of weapons and men. We achieve greater levels of detail and flavour at the cost of players needing to keep track of up to a dozen different types or element type stats per side. The army lists are slightly more difficult to create, but are still easy to pull together, commonly used in most battalion element scale figure gaming rules today. Finally, we come to the lots of details, specifically taking into account all supporting troops by using a point system. Creating army lists is very difficult, and it should be noted players could use any point system in order to do this. The advantage is we get a historically accurate unit which would allow players to refight historical conflicts without the risk of unusual results. This is not really used commonly by anyone that I'm aware of, although possibly some of the more advanced SPI board games get into this area. All 3 approaches are reasonable. It all depends on what players wish to achieve in a game. I, for one, am impressed with the last approach, and I suspect I may create some army lists using this approach in the future. But for now, most of my gaming uses approach 2. And so we come to an end of episode 67 of my video series on game design theory, in this case discussing the issues surrounding battalion element scale rules. Just as an interesting point, when I first created this set of rules, I went with what I said was option 2, which is base the strength of battalions on the number of tanks, etc., etc. Since that particular point in time, I now have fully adopted the points system. That is, grab a sufficiently detailed point system, ram it into a THEORIE, get a value, divide it by something, and then that gives me a value. And that seems to work reasonably well. Alle guten Dinge kommen zu einem Ende.